Psychoanalysis and the Future of Global Politics by Robert Samuels. Freud's approach to our global future. At the start of this text on the future of humankind, Freud articulates why it is so difficult to address global issues. Having lived for quite some time within a specific culture and tried repeatedly to study the nature of its origins and the path of its development, one also feels tempted just occasionally to turn around and look in the other direction and ask what fate has in store for that culture and what changes it is destined to undergo. One quickly becomes aware, however, that any such venture is invalidated from the outset by several factors, chief among which that only a few individuals are capable of commanding an overview of human activity in all its ramifications. Most people have found it necessary to concentrate on one or a small number of fields, yet the less a person knows about past and present, the shakier that person's judgment will inevitably be with regard to the future. This initial acceptance of our inability to comprehend the totality of human culture represents one of Freud's key Enlightenment values, which concerns an acceptance of the limits of our knowledge. Following Kant, Freud defines modern science in part by humility and the realization that we cannot know everything, and our understanding is limited by our perspective. In fact, in Totem and Taboo, he argues that an essential difference between civilizations centered on religion and ones based on science is that in the scientific world, we give up a belief that we can know everything or that some higher power has complete knowledge. Modern science then begins with an acknowledgement of lack and limitations. Yet this lack of knowledge drives the desire to know the truth about reality. The pursuit of the reality principle is centered on gaining a limited impartial view of the world, but this project is itself blocked by individual psychology. Another factor is that in this judgment in particular, the subjective expectations of the individual play a role that is hard to assess. Yet those expectations turn out to depend on purely personal elements in an individual's own experience, his or her more or less hopeful attitude to life, as dictated by temperament and by degree of success or lack of it. Freud affirms here that one of the greatest obstacles for understanding the world is our own personality and particular psychopathology. In other words, as we shall see, particular ideologies cater to specific psychopathologies. From Freud's perspective, the only way to gain a more accurate sense of the world is for people to be able to remove themselves from their own thoughts, feelings, and judgments. There is the effect of the remarkable fact that people in general experience their present almost naively, unable to appreciate what it holds. They must first put some distance between it and them. In other words, the present must first have become the past before it will furnish clues for assessing what is to come. This need for distance and delay points to a central aspect of modernity, globalism, and the reality principle, which involves the ability of people to remove themselves from their own understanding. Starting with his project for a scientific psychology, Freud bases his theory and method on the Enlightenment ideal of neutrality and free thought. Just as the analyst has to refrain from judgment in order to help the patient to say whatever comes to their mind, the modern scientist is supposed to employ reason by removing all personal self-interest through the process of critical introspection. Of course, this goal of neutral reason can never be fully attained, but it shapes the modern global institutions of science and universal human rights. Freud's text then shows how, in order to understand reason, you have to use reason, and this discourse of truth is difficult to achieve. Thus, the biggest resistance to understanding and pursuing global progress is our own resistances to reason itself. In fact, one could argue that Freud's entire work is dedicated to applying reason to unreason so that more reason can be achieved. Freud's definition of human society. Before Freud articulates how we can more effectively make the world more reasonable, he provides a very interesting definition of human societies. It includes, on the one hand, all the knowledge and skill that humanity has acquired in order to control the forces of nature and obtain from it goods to satisfy human needs, and on the other hand, all the institutions that are required to govern the relations of human beings one to another, and in particular, the distribution of such goods as can be obtained. This understanding of human society focuses on the use of knowledge to control nature and to satisfy human needs by organizing the ways people interact and distribute goods. Using a functionalist theory, Freud posits that the main goal of civilization is to maintain stability by regulating nature and human relationships. In many ways, this is a conservative model because the central task is to conserve the social order. In his description of the conservative foundation of human societies, Freud often sounds like a Marxist because he realizes that behind the quest for social stability, one finds the dual drives to achieve instinctual satisfaction and exploit others for profit. The two directions of culture are not independent of each other, firstly because the mutual relations of human beings are extensively influenced by the amount of drive satisfaction made possible by the commodities available, secondly because the individual human being can himself, vis-à-vis another person, assume the relationship of a commodity insofar as the other person makes us use of the said individual's labor or takes the individual as sexual object, but thirdly, because every individual is in virtual terms an enemy of culture, which is in fact supposed to constitute a universal human interest. Freud combines psychoanalysis and Marxism here by arguing that societies not only have to try to satisfy human impulses, but they also function to turn people into commodities and sexual objects. He adds that while society itself should be a universal value, every individual is actually an enemy of the state. This battle between society and the individual cannot be resolved for Freud, and it is wrong to see him as promoting either individual liberation or social regulation. Instead, throughout his career, he maintained that there is a fundamental, unresolvable conflict shaping human beings. In fact, as we shall see in later chapters, the promise to resolve this conflict is often at the center of most ideologies. However, for Freud, we can never escape the primary conflict. Moreover, Freud's conservative view of culture claims that the driving force behind civilization is conserving a social order dedicated to controlling nature and distributing goods. Their purpose is not only to put in place a certain distribution of goods, but also to maintain it. There is a need, in fact, for them to protect against the hostile impulses of humanity, everything that serves to tame nature and generate commodities. Freud's realism here points to the fact that behind every call for social order, we find an economic imperative, which also requires people giving up their own desires. In one of his most critical insights, Freud affirms that conservative social orders are predicated on the ability of a powerful minority to impose their will on the disempowered masses. This gives the impression that culture is something imposed on a reluctant majority by a minority that has managed to gain possession of the instruments of power and coercion. From this perspective, civilization is defined by exploitation and coercion, and yet Freud also claims that social arrangements can be made less oppressive if they are based on the modern principles of equality and individual freedom, even if those ideals are never fully attained. While Freud does at times point to ways of moving beyond conservative ideology and an oppressive social hierarchy, he never wavers from his fundamental argument that the conflict between individuals and society can never be resolved. One would think that some rearrangement of human relationships must be possible, such as would cause the sources of dissatisfaction with culture to dry up by renouncing coercion and the suppression of drives and allowing people to devote themselves to acquiring and enjoying commodities undisturbed by inner discord. That would be the golden age, except that one wonders whether such a condition can ever be realized. It seems instead that every culture must be based on coercion and drive renunciation. It does not even appear certain that with coercion removed, the majority of human beings will be prepared to take upon themselves the labor that must be performed if greater quantities of essential commodities are to be obtained. Freud is clearly not one to endorse pure individualism or the ability of humans to do away with an economic system based on commodities and enforced labor. His tragic vision of humankind is honest and realistic, and this is why so many people from different ideological perspectives are quick to dismiss it. Since Freud is dedicated to discovering the truth through free thought and critical introspection, he refuses to repress upsetting aspects of human life. We need, in my view, to accept that destructive, antisocial, and anti-cultural tendencies are present in all human beings, and that in the largest proportion of people, such tendencies are powerful enough to dictate their behavior within human society. Just as our knowledge is always limited, Freud asserts that our ability to control our antisocial impulses is also limited, and so we must build the future by recognizing these limitations. Although most Marxist analysts would focus on how best to distribute goods in society, Freud argues that this approach is not sufficient. Whereas our first impression was that the key thing about culture was the conquest of nature in order to obtain the commodities essential to life, and that the dangers threatening culture could be removed by effective distribution of such goods among human beings, the emphasis now seems to have shifted away from the material towards the mental. It becomes crucial whether to and what extent the burden of the libidinal sacrifices imposed on human beings can be successfully lightened and human beings reconciled to and compensated for the part of that burden that inevitably remains. From this perspective, it is necessary to think beyond the social distribution of material goods, so that one can address the problems caused by the social demands for instinctual sacrifice. For Freud, a key factor to this analysis is the question of whether people think they are being properly compensated for what they are giving up. Freud not only thinks that there will always be discontentment in civilization, but he also affirms that the majority of human beings will have to be forced to work and to give up their drives in order to make society function. Domination of the mass by a minority can no more be dispensed with that coercion to perform cultural work, because masses are lethargic and unreasonable, they are averse to renouncing their drives, they cannot be persuaded by arguments that this is unavoidable, and individuals within masses reinforce one another in giving free rein to their lack of restraint. This rather negative conception of human nature undermines the argument that people want to sacrifice for a shared goal and that they desire to work and they are susceptible to reason. Yet Freud's entire discourse is founded on applying reason to unreason, and so we have to ask, how can a global society centered on rationality, science, and democracy be possible?